Stories bigger than Texas, the Alamo podcast. The recent Independence Day in the United States creates a time of reflection. The country is 248 years old. Texas has been a part of it for about 179. And for all those years, presidents have been connected to the Alamo. Today, we reveal all the U.S. presidents who have been to the Alamo or impacted its history, the speeches they gave, the photos they took, and how their connections here have continued the site's enduring legacy. I'm your host, Emily Balcom. We are once again joined by Thomas Ledesma, the Alamo's researcher. Thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me, Emily. I'm excited to be here today.
Our chat about presidential connections to the Alamo has to begin with James K. Polk, the 11th U.S. president who brought Texas into the nation.
Right. If you're talking about Texas joining the United States, you need to understand who's the president of the United States at that time and who's instrumental in making that happen. Now, of course, there's presidents before Polk that are interested in Texas. Of course, a lot of people are watching what Andrew Jackson's doing during the Revolution and the presidents after that. But the big push to annex Texas happens a little bit before Polk with President Tyler. And right before he leaves office, he is able to muster together this congressional approval to annex Texas. And then he goes, "See you later, I'm out." And Polk kind of gets handed this very complex issue. And he does get the support needed, both in the United States, but also his agents in Texas are working with commissioners from the Republic on annexation. And finally, they're able to come together and get Texas admitted into the United States. Polk is instrumental in doing that. And of course, that leads to a war with Mexico, and Polk is instrumental in leading the country through that conflict as well.
We had a podcast episode last fall about a historian's road trip you took part in, and one of the stops on that road trip was going to Polk's ancestral home. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that was great. So myself and Colby Lanham, a senior researcher and historian, had a chance to stop in Columbia, Tennessee, and see the Polk ancestral home. Now, it's sad because Polk himself, the president, and his wife's home no longer existed. It was about a few blocks adjacent down the street, but his parents' home still is around. And it's a fascinating place to visit, beautiful place. It's so full of items that are connected to President Polk himself. So even though his home doesn't exist, a lot of his personal items do. There's a beautiful table they have with the presidential seal on it that was his in the office, and it's just a beautiful place to learn about a president that a lot of people don't think about.
President Rutherford B. Hayes visits the Alamo in 1849, nearly 30 years before taking office. And his observations that you uncovered are quite interesting.
Yeah, so another of those early presidents that people don't think about a lot, but Rutherford B. Hayes, yes, long before he becomes the 19th president of the United States, he went to Kenyon College and then Harvard Law School. And while he was in Kenyon College, he had become friends with a gentleman by the name of Guy M. Bryan, who was from Texas. And after the war with Mexico had settled down, really at the tail end, his friend is writing him letters saying, "You should come visit Texas. It's a wonderful place. It's a lot different than what's happening back east. You should come down here." So Rutherford and his uncle agree to come down. And it's about the end of 1848 into 1849, and they take a ship down to New Orleans and then into East Texas. They meet up with Mr. Bryan, and they have a good time. And then they take a trip inland, and they go to Austin, and he has some interesting observations about that town, but then they come to San Antonio. On Saturday, February 24th, which is interesting because it's a commemorative day that we focus on today. They weren't doing much back then, it seems. But he talks about visiting the Alamo. And in his diary entry for that day says, "Visit the Alamo with Mr. Bean." And I don't think it's that Mr. Bean.
Not that Mr. Bean.
Visits the grave of Walker and Gillespie, the Alamo, and they find a party of California immigrants cooking in the room where Crockett fell. Now, my guess on what that room could be is either the confessional or the baptistry inside the church, more than likely is what I think, because those two rooms have roofs over them.
But we don't think Crockett fell inside the church.
Exactly. And later on, because of some displays that were put up in the church, at one point there was a mannequin kind of looking like Jim Bowie in one of those rooms, and people always got that image in their head that he was in there. But yes, of course, Crockett does not perish in the church. Bowie doesn't perish in the church. But we can see how these local tales kind of grow roots and people begin to go with those things.
President Ulysses S. Grant visits the Alamo in the 1880s after leaving office.
This visit is monumental to the rest of the visits we'll talk about. By 1880, the railroad has been fairly established here in San Antonio. You have electric trolley carts and horse-drawn trolley carts going around, the post office, telegram lines, things like that. And San Antonio is a prime example of these frontier borderland towns becoming more industrialized and into a modern city, if you will. Grant has already completed 2 terms by this point, and he decides he's going to go on a whirlwind tour of Texas. So he ends up coming to San Antonio. There's also talk going on about him running for a third term, which is unknown at this time. So there's a lot of the stuff going on in U.S. history at the moment that Grant comes to Texas. And I think it's the beginning of people saying, we need to harness the political abilities of these growing towns in the West, San Antonio being one of those big towns. And so he comes to San Antonio. He visits at the Menger Hotel. He stays there for a little bit. They talk about a demonstration of Gatling guns and revolving Hotchkiss cannons at Fort Sam. And it is mentioned that the day after Grant gets here, quietly in the morning, he is escorted over to the Alamo and he takes a look around.
President Benjamin Harrison comes to the Alamo during his time in office in 1891, and you found a newspaper article about his visit.
What was interesting about Harrison's visit, obviously it's the first sitting president to come visit San Antonio, so it's a big deal. And it's very similar to what happens with Grant's visit. The whole city turns out. They're decorating everywhere. There's throngs of people everywhere. And interesting about the date he's visiting, that's supposed to be the day that the Battle of Flowers Parade begins.
Wow.
In 1891. Now, you think about this. The president's coming. The Battle of Flowers Parade is going to happen. Everybody, the city, we know how Fiesta gets now. It's like everybody's excited. But Mother Nature has different plans. And it is a tremendously bad day for weather. It's raining everywhere. It's soggy. And we have some pretty interesting descriptions of what downtown looks like. The red, white, and blue is not distinguishable on the Alamo Plaza. And the Hugo and Schmelzer building, where the president was to review the public, looks very forlorn. So the president was supposed to be on the Alamo grounds, watching this review and parade. And unfortunately, because of the weather, they have to move him somewhere else, and they move him to the Grand Opera House, and they have a big celebration there, and he gives a few words.
So he's still in Alamo Plaza.
Correct. Yep. He comes to visit Alamo Plaza. While he's giving some words in the Opera House, he talks about the importance of education and learning in Texas, but he also kind of makes a comment about the rain, which I think is a lot of people can relate to that today. He says, according to the farmers and ranchers out in West Texas, this rainstorm is worth $5 million.
Wow.
And he goes, because I'm the president, maybe I should take credit for the weather, but if I can't get that, at least to take half the amount that they claimed it for, and people got a good laugh out of that. And after that, they took a short trip to Main Plaza, and then he was off to El Paso.
Next up, President William McKinley visits the Alamo in 1901 and gives a speech.
1901, a new century has begun, and William McKinley is our president. And on May 4th, 1901, he comes to San Antonio in the early morning hours. And here's another great description about downtown. A panorama of patriotism, such has not been seen here since the outbreak of the Spanish War. The air was rent with cheers as the procession passed along, and there was a continual ovation from all sides. Old and young, rich and poor, black and white, all mingled together to pay homage to the nation's leader, and Old Glory was seen waving whichever way the eye turned.
This wasn't a time where you could turn on the TV every second and see a president.
Right.
This was your one moment to see the president.
Exactly, and for most people, that was it. And to think about how beautiful and patriotic the plaza would have looked like, that's pretty exciting to me.
It definitely is.
So his review stand was facing north to the post office that was there, and so the Alamo would have been on his right-hand side. And he has a great quote here. He goes, "I'm glad to be in this historic city, on this historic spot, to receive from you the greeting and goodwill which you all feel toward the great republic and toward the office, which for a little while, by your suffrage, I am permitted to fill. I stand here near the Alamo, this sacred and historic place. I cannot fail to recall the names of Crockett, Travis, Bowie, and their heroic associates who went down after an 11-day siege, sacrificing their lives for liberty and independence. They are the sacrificial giants that cleave the dark asunder and brought us where we are. They fell devoted to their cause, and their fame will last forever." Of course, the president didn't have all his facts correct there. 11 days is not correct, but his sentiment, I think, is spot on. A few more comments are given. He goes into the church, and he gives us some comments about what he thought about the building specifically. And he goes, "It's a truly wonderful old building, and patriotism seems imbued in the very atmosphere around it." Some of the DRT members gave him a gift of a little guidebook, and he also was gifted a painting.
And here's one president whose visits have really been remembered over time, Theodore Roosevelt.
Oh, yes. And full disclosure for all you folks listening out there, I'm a big Theodore Roosevelt fan, so I'm going to try my best to not go overboard. Theodore Roosevelt has a deep connection to San Antonio, and he's been to San Antonio in South Texas several times. His first time is going to be in 1892. He's working in the civil service department of the government, and there's some issues with the post office here in San Antonio. They think there's been some political hirings and firings that need to be investigated. So he comes down to San Antonio to investigate, but he's a big outdoorsman, and he's never hunted javelina or peccary, so he decides to book a hunt in South Texas, and he writes about that in his book, The Wilderness Hunter. Now, the most famous time he visits is a few years after that, in 1898, when he's lieutenant colonel of the Rough Rider Regiment, as it becomes known. And so he arrives in San Antonio. The commander of the regiment, Leonard Wood, is already here, and he's selected a site for the men to muster. By this time, most of the soldiers have been brought into the regiment. They're just looking for a place to gather and train before they head to Tampa Bay, and then from Tampa Bay to Cuba. With that, though, you have soldiers gathered together. They're training. There's accidents. There's mishaps. Some soldiers are let go. Some, unfortunately, perish. And so they need to refill the ranks. And so even though the story goes that Roosevelt set up the Rough Riders in the Menger Hotel, not quite, but a few men did sneak into the Menger Hotel to track him down and ask to get signed up for the regiment. And so he does.
And the Alamo has in its collection a book that Theodore Roosevelt signed. Can you describe that book for us?
Yeah, so for a long time, and even somewhat today, we have a guest register. And so people can come and sign in their name and where they're from, typical stuff that a lot of historic sites do. And one of those registers, plain, simple register, but on the front it says Rough Riders. And when you open it up, you can find the signatures of Leonard Wood and Theodore Roosevelt. But if you go to the pages prior, you can see all these names with the western states: Oklahoma, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, some other places in Texas. And then you also have some New England and New York folks sprinkled in, and that's essentially a muster of the Rough Riders. They all came here to visit.
And Theodore Roosevelt visits as president in 1905.
William McKinley passes away. He gets assassinated, and Theodore Roosevelt becomes president of the United States. And so he comes in 1905, and it's a tour that he's doing throughout the West, and it's a Rough Rider reunion here in San Antonio. And we have a wonderful picture of him riding kind of almost in the middle towards the Alamo doors. And on the left-hand side, you can see some of the Army troopers from Fort Sam, but also some of the Rough Riders sprinkled in, riding as well towards the bandstand. Sharing one of the quotes from his speech there is interesting. "I cannot say how much it meant to me to be able to take part in raising that regiment under the shadow of the Alamo. My admiration for Texas and Texans is no new thing. Since I have been a boy and first studied the history of this country, my veins have thrilled and tingled as I read of the mighty deeds of Houston, Bowie, Crockett, Travis, of the glorious men who fell in the fight of the Alamo, which it was said Thermopylae had its messenger of death, but the Alamo had none." And he also said, talking about his time with the Rough Riders in San Antonio, "I remember well 7 years ago when we were raising the regiment, riding in here one day to see the Alamo, and going away feeling that come what may, I was going to try to handle myself so that no disgrace should come to the memory of the Americans who died here."
One of our strongest presidential connections to the Alamo. Moving on through time, President Calvin Coolidge visits on the Battle of the Alamo anniversary, March 6, 1930. Not much is known about his visit, but he did sign the guest book. A bit later, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes to the Alamo on June 11, 1936. He signs the guest book as well. His visit marks a bit of a turning point because it's so heavily photographed at a time when photography is really reaching the masses.
Right. It's like a different technology hits San Antonio throughout these visits, and you can see, Grant and the railroad and the subsequent presidents after that, and then, like you said, Theodore Roosevelt and this mass media taking place. But you couldn't find two different presidents. You tell somebody Calvin Coolidge, and they look at you and say, I've heard that name before, but who was he? You say Franklin Delano Roosevelt or FDR, and they're like, oh, okay, I know
Everybody
exactly.
knows.
Yeah. Different presidents, different personalities, different times. Right? Calvin Coolidge is leading the United States during this time of somewhat excess. The Roaring '20s into up to the Great Depression, and then the Great Depression happens, and Franklin Delano becomes the president. But they both decided it was important to visit the Alamo. Now, Calvin Coolidge was a very reserved individual. He comes to San Antonio, and he's brought into the church on March 6, 1930. So another commemorative day. Governor Moody is here to greet President Coolidge, and a report gives us this little insight to the visit. As Coolidge passed through the bullet-marked doorway, stained with the blood of Texas heroes, he became the fourth man who had been president of the United States to enter the Alamo, which isn't necessarily true, but I digress. Coolidge signed the Alamo registry. The Coolidge signature, however, was as cool and precise as the Vermont hills. And it was noted that he showed a deep interest in the side rooms of the Alamo. Like many people do today, it's like, oh, that kind of looks old, is that original? And of course they are. And after that quick visit, he was taken to the train to go up to Austin. And somebody asked him, what'd you think about your visit in San Antonio? And kind of this dry New England humor, he goes, I originally thought we stopped here just to eat breakfast. So, but it seemed to be he had a good time. Of course, 6 years later, now things have changed in the United States. I think a part of FDR's visit to San Antonio and to the Alamo is because he's looking for images and places that represent this American spirit that try to help get the country moving forward through this very difficult time. On June 11th, 1936, President Roosevelt comes and he lays a wreath, and he writes, "Fate has been kind to me today. In my many travels, a visit to the Alamo has hitherto been impossible. I, therefore, welcome this opportunity of visiting this shrine, to pay my small tribute to the heroes who laid down their lives 100 years ago in order that Texas might become first an independent nation and later a mighty state of the Union. And speaking to the sacrifice of those individuals, he said, I hope they know that we have not discarded or lost the virility and ideals of the pioneer. I hope they know that the overwhelming majority of Americans of 1936 are once more meeting new problems with courage, that we too are ready and willing to stand up and fight for truth against falsehood, for freedom of the individual against license by the few. Of course, another impact that the FDR administration has is with the Works Project Administration.
Right. Tell us about those WPA projects. One famously the Riverwalk, but there were also projects here at the Alamo.
WPA is one of those ways that Roosevelt's talking about meeting these new challenges. They're going to create jobs and projects, and a lot of them focus on natural areas. You do have some major infrastructure projects, but also historic sites. Here in San Antonio, you mentioned the Riverwalk, the missions, and including the Alamo. And so we have the arcade. If you're looking at the Alamo Church, to the right-hand side, you have the arcade. We do have a building formerly known as Alamo Hall that is becoming the Cavaliers Education Center, and the flooring in that building still has the iconic WPA tiles in there.
And that flooring will be preserved in the new Texas Cavaliers Education Center.
Exactly. And then also the wall that goes around the back gardens area was a part of the WPA projects.
Before we move on from FDR's visit, we've got to talk about that famous photograph of him in the car, just surrounded by people. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about it is that you couldn't drive a car today that close to the front doors of the Alamo Church. Back then, things were a little bit different.
Yes, he's very, very close. And of course, some of that is also if he wanted to go inside the church because of his mobility problems that he was having during his presidency. They wanted to be able to get him in and out of a building very quickly and safely. But yes, of course, now we keep automobiles as far away as possible due to the impact that it has on the buildings with emissions and vibrations and things like that, and also accidents. You don't want anything risking harm to the church.
In the 1940s, we see President Harry Truman come to the Alamo and really invoke the history.
Yeah, what another interesting president, having to fill the shoes of such a big personality like FDR, who also had to lead the country through a pretty tumultuous time and did some unprecedented things as president. And so Truman's a little more low-key than FDR was, but he shows up on September 26, 1948, and it's a Sunday. And that kind of changes what we know about what happens here, because anytime a president has come up to this point, even a former president, you see the pomp and circumstance, and there's bunting and flags and press and all these people. And there's some press here on that day, but San Antonians overall weren't out there greeting necessarily President Truman. And he tells us why. My whole political career, I've refused to do speeches or any kind of political workings on the Sabbath, and I intend to keep it that way. So the reporters wanted some information, and he said, I'm not giving it to you. But he did give us some thoughts on the Alamo itself, something not political. This, of course, stands as one of the most historic monuments of the world. A monument to heroism, a monument to fight for liberty all over the world. As I stood in the Alamo and read that letter of Colonel Travis, and then read that letter of the boy who got the black bean, it came to me that those men and boys, and a lot of them were boys, were standing for something for which this great country has fought 3 or 4 wars. It really makes the chills go up and down your spine, and it makes you wonder why.
Also around that time, Dwight Eisenhower is not yet president, but he's spending a lot of time here in San Antonio.
Yes, another president that has deep, deep roots to the San Antonio area. At this point, Eisenhower, in the 40s at least, he becomes Supreme Allied Commander during World War II. Before that, he's in and around San Antonio. After he graduates from West Point, he is assigned as a young lieutenant to Fort Sam. And so he's here at Fort Sam, and he's just not doing his military duties. He's getting out into the community, and he's getting involved in a lot of local schools, which is really awesome. He seems to be a very great teacher, and that follows him throughout his military career.
He's a football coach at St. Mary's University. He met his wife here, and they signed the guest book.
They came several times throughout. He did sign.
October 14th, 1952.
Exactly. And so he's here, and that's an important date because it's also his birthday.
Oh.
Eisenhower is doing this very lightning fast tour, campaigning through Texas, 2 days. So he's hitting a lot of stops. And they have a birthday cake for him in Houston, and then later on here in San Antonio, they have a little celebration for him again.
In November 1960, just days before the presidential election, Richard Nixon visits the Alamo. He's the sitting vice president in a tight race with John F. Kennedy. He doesn't know it then, but he's going to lose that race, but win a different race for president later in the decade. But right now, he's just in campaign mode.
Right, and I think this gives us a good insight of how visits are starting to change at the Alamo. You have Truman coming by, and it's a low-key event, just wanting to see historic sites. I'm sure the ambassadors that are here from San Antonio and the city are trying to just give him a good time and show him what makes San Antonio so unique. But now you see with Nixon and subsequent presidents, they're here campaigning hard. So they're using the Alamo as a backdrop.
He claims it's the largest crowd ever gathered for a political meeting at the Alamo. I don't know if there's a way to substantiate that from a historic perspective, but he does sign the guest book during that visit in 1960, plus during an earlier visit as vice president in 1956. Meantime, President John F. Kennedy also visits the Alamo before the 1960 election.
So yeah, now we see both political parties are using the Alamo as a backdrop to go ahead and get their faces out there, and they're using the iconic image of the Alamo facade that really everybody knows. But they're also tying it into the struggles of the day. There's a lot of division in the country, and so they're looking for symbols to kind of talk about how the nation can come together.
We have photos of him signing the guest book. He's there with Texas native Lyndon Johnson, his running mate for vice president, and of course, future president himself after JFK is assassinated.
One thing that Kennedy had said that I think was pretty powerful before we move on to LBJ is he's talking about the Alamo and the sacrifice that happened here, how he's honored to come speak before this distinguished American memorial. And he writes, when the Texans died for Texan independence, there were not only native-born Texans in the Alamo. There were not only citizens of Tennessee and North Carolina, but there were citizens from Massachusetts, people who came here to shed blood with other folks in the Alamo. He's trying to, again, point to that unification of the country, that we might be from different places and do different things, but we can come together.
And him being from Massachusetts, he signs the guest book as from Massachusetts.
Yes,
He's
yes,
making that time. JFK did come to San Antonio the day before he was assassinated, but did not stop at the Alamo. Meantime, Lyndon Johnson did not make an official visit to the Alamo as president, but he famously invoked the Alamo when talking about Vietnam.
We see so many parallels, obviously, when combat and different conflicts are brought up with the Alamo, even into the modern time. You find yourself in a situation where you're outnumbered. A lot of deep diving has to be done internally on what your choice is going to be, to run or stay, to dig in and fight. The idea is that when you think of the Alamo are sacrifice, but also on the other side, it's a symbol of doom almost. You know, for some people, it's the garrison here falls and these men are killed. Using that parallel can be very powerful. And of course, coming from somebody who's a native Texan, who'd probably been here several times as a younger person.
He signed the guest book many times over the years.
Exactly. So he understands that not only is the Alamo representative of the heroic choice to sacrifice yourself for the greater good, but it's also a symbol of defeat.
Texas Monthly quotes LBJ telling the National Security Council, "Hell, Vietnam is just like the Alamo."
I think for a lot of our veterans out there that served in that conflict, they probably ran into that feeling several times themselves, feeling that they were left behind and then coming home to sometimes pretty horrendous treatment. I can see how they would felt like they were abandoned too.
Moving on through history, President Gerald Ford visits the Alamo April 9th, 1976, according to the guest book. His presidential library actually has on its website the scanned cue cards he used in his speech with handwritten edits.
Yes, an interesting visit. For multiple reasons.
Made a little bit of news.
He did make a little bit of news. He says that it's a tremendous honor to join everybody in this commemoration at the cradle of Texas liberty, and that these hallowed grounds were already in physical ruins when Colonel Travis sounded his battle call for the people of Texas and all Americans in the world. He says, because of a single great battle, the Alamo has put on the immortality of history. More than a shrine to Texas valor, more than a landmark of American courage, the Alamo is a monument to human freedom. Here, the eyes of Texas and the attention of the world focused on more than 180 remarkable men who gave all they had to give in the defense of liberty.
That's a great speech, but what people really remember about Gerald Ford's visit is something that happened in Cavalry Courtyard.
Yes, so just like anything else we do around here, you gotta have refreshments and treats. And so President Ford is brought over to Cavalry Courtyard and handed a plate with San Antonio tradition, a couple tamales on there. And he picks it up, and to the horror of everybody in the courtyard, just begins to chomp down.
Corn shuck and all.
Yes, corn shuck and all. If you're not familiar what a tamale is, you have corn masa and meal, sometimes with a meat filling or a cheese filling, wrapped up and steamed in a corn husk. And you're supposed to peel the husk. Well, nobody told the president that, and so he chomped down, and it was quite the thing. There are even some political analysts out there that say, did this corn husk cost Ford his election?
It's one of those unsubstantiated things, but it's rumored that a DRT member grabbed the plate from him and helped him through it.
Yes.
Meantime, Lila Cockrell was mayor at the time, San Antonio's first female mayor, and she had a pretty funny reaction.
In one of her quotes afterwards, she said that when everybody saw him pick it up and chomp on it, everybody gulped. And then said, I guess nobody gave him a briefing on how to eat a tamale before he got to San Antonio.
In modern day politics, he would have had that briefing.
Yes, of course. He would have been squared away. They probably would have peeled it already.
Yes. President Jimmy Carter visits the Alamo twice, once while campaigning for president in 1976. There's a hand-drawn flyer we've seen advertising his visit, and then he visits again November 1st, 1980, in the final days of that campaign.
Again, another example of politicians looking to harness the political power that's rising in San Antonio, looking to harness and kind of make San Antonio a bastion for whichever party they're a part of. And so if you're going to come to San Antonio and you want to gather attention, you're going to do it at a place that people understand and recognize. And so he chooses the Alamo.
And he talked about development of the area.
Right. He talks about the redevelopment of this area, especially Alamo Plaza and the Riverwalk. And he mentions that in his speech. He goes, the Alamo will soon be seeing new action, redevelopment. It'll be linked to another historic site, the San Antonio River. He's talking about a lot of the money that's been transferred by the Urban Development Action Grant Program that brought about $48 million to San Antonio and helping create jobs in the area. So it shows the importance and development of Alamo Plaza is more far-reaching than just the few blocks that it makes up. It really does have a change on the community here in San Antonio, but also the national community is watching too on how we do things down here.
President Ronald Reagan visits the Alamo in 1983. He'd visited before in 1976 and signed the guest book, but in 1983, he's president.
Yes, so Ronald Reagan actually has a few trips to San Antonio, a few to the Alamo, like you've mentioned. He signs the book a few times, and of course, trying to garner support for a presidential campaign, re-election, and why not choose the Alamo? But he does spend a lot of time also at the outlying bases here in San Antonio, Military City, USA.
President George H.W. Bush visits the Alamo as sitting vice president March 2nd in 1986. He signed the guest book, and the importance of that day, it is the sesquicentennial of Texas independence.
Yeah, 150 years for those who aren't familiar with that term. Big deal. And for us, of course, Mr. Bush coming to Texas, adopting it as his home state. What's so important about that anniversary is it's a big one, 150, and it revitalizes people's interest in the Alamo story. We have a few points throughout the history up to today where we can see a bump and rise in people's interest in the Alamo story. Early on in the 1900s, you see some silent films and things like that being made. You have a 100-year anniversary, so on and so forth, 150. And then eventually, you had the John Wayne films and the Fess Parker productions going on with Disney. So you see these spikes, and 150 was a big spike. And we do have quite a collection of items, commemorative items from the 150th.
Something that's really cool about his guest book signature is that next to his signature, there's his business card as Vice President of the United States. And you don't think that a sitting Vice President of the United States, one of the most recognizable people in the world, would need or have a business card. But we have it. It's here at the Alamo.
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
President Bill Clinton visits the Alamo twice. The first time as a candidate in 1992, a whistle-stop tour that included a boat ride down the Riverwalk. And that's when the famous photo was taken of Clinton jogging in front of the Alamo Church. What else can you tell us about that visit?
One thing that visit did with that jogging in front of the Alamo was it put the Alamo back in the eye of the public. Here you see the president jogging past the Alamo, and people begin to think, oh, hey, what about that place? And it kind of spurs this interest. And also, I think it also reinvigorates people to embrace the Alamo here, to be proud that we have this historic structure and the other ones in town. And
this was at a time when tourism in San Antonio was really becoming a juggernaut as well.
Exactly. And so he talks about redevelopment that's happening under President Carter and all these things. And I mean, you can see that development happening under FDR. And then coming and building up. And like you're saying, until we get to the 90s where you have this big boom, and that becomes one of the mainstays of how San Antonio runs.
In November 1996, President Bill Clinton visits the Alamo Church and gives a speech out front. It's actually all posted on the Clinton Presidential Library YouTube channel, starting with the moment he exits the front doors of the church.
So much support for him in San Antonio at that time, and a lot of interesting folks that are on the stage with him, including actor Tommy Lee Jones. So interesting. One of the things is he mentions his previous visits to San Antonio, and he goes, I remember so many things. But this place, the Alamo, has always symbolized to me the transformation of Texas, the transformation of America, and the best hope for our future. The Alamo is not just a place of great personal courage, it is a place of great standoff in the beginning between two nations and two peoples. The story of the Alamo over the last 160 years and the story of San Antonio is the story of reconciliation and friendships between two great nations and two great peoples, here in Texas and throughout the United States. It is a great, great story.
Turning now to President George W. Bush, also a former Texas governor. He visited the Alamo several times as governor, and his wife and former First Lady Laura Bush recently recorded a video for the Alamo that included some really fascinating details on their connections here.
Of course, being the governor of Texas. You're going to come down here several times, more than likely. Our current governor has been here a few times, and previous governors as well, and other state officials.
Laura Bush remembers family road trips to visit the Alamo, staying at the Menger Hotel. She remembers the elementary and middle schools in Midland were named after the heroes and battles of Texas independence. In this video, she says she attended James Bowie Elementary and San Jacinto Junior High, and the president attended Sam Houston Elementary. So just really cool to hear those connections.
Yes. I had the opportunity to meet former First Lady Bush, and what a wonderful woman, and we're so thankful for her support. Not only herself as a youngster growing up and coming to the Alamo, and of course, President Bush more than likely did the same, but her journey as an educator. And she sees how important preserving these historic sites, especially the Alamo, that iconic historic site of Texas, and being sure that we have the resources needed and the support needed to go ahead and further our mission of educating the next generation on what the Alamo is.
We're really grateful for her support of the Texas Cavaliers Education Center and all her fundraising efforts for that. A really cool find in the Alamo guest book. In the early 90s, she brought her daughters, the twins, Barbara and Jenna, when they were just kids. So that's an educator sharing the story of Texas history with her daughters.
And it goes to show that no matter who you are, you could be the first lady of a state, the first lady of a nation, or just a regular person, and you're going to come here and bring your family to learn about the history. And that's what I love about being here is I've met so many people from all over the world, all different backgrounds, and they're coming here because, again, they've been told to remember the Alamo, but they're not sure why. And it's our fantastic duty to go ahead and inform them on why they're supposed to remember.
The fact that so many presidents throughout U.S. history have some sort of connection to the Alamo, what does that tell us about the site's enduring legacy?
I think it shows that even though times change and politics ebb and flow and different ideals go back and forth, there are a few mainstays that we can look toward, for example. And the Alamo has a long and complicated history, but it also is a symbol of resilience and unification. Just like President Kennedy talked about, you had people from all over the United States and the world we know coming here to fight for a common goal and that idea. Did they get it right? Surely not. When the United States won its independence, we didn't get it right, and I argue today that we still don't have it right necessarily. But it's the fact that the sacrifice was made so that people today can work towards those ideals of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and that we're all created equal. And I think that's the enduring legacy of the Alamo, and that's why politicians, at least the ones we talked about, gravitate here, because they know that there's power in symbolism, and the symbolism of sacrifice and unity can be seen here. Going off of that, there's one last quote here, and if you've guessed, I'm going to pull a quote from Theodore Roosevelt. You are correct. He goes, "Here in San Antonio, what is the building you are proudest of?" Exactly, the Alamo. It is not exactly up to date. Other buildings are larger. You are proud of it because it commemorates forever the spirit of those who made its fame immortal. And that's, of course, in the cause of liberty.
Thomas Ledesma, thank you so much for joining us and all the research you put into this episode.
Thanks for having me, Emily.
Be sure to check out the podcast notes. It is chock full of links this week. We've linked to all the presidential signatures we could find in the Alamo guest book and to a video featuring our historians touring the President James K. Polk ancestral home. We've also linked to the verbatim remarks both Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy gave at the Alamo before the 1960 election, courtesy the University of California at Santa Barbara, plus Gerald Ford's verbatim remarks, courtesy his presidential library, and the Associated Press photo of him eating that tamale still inside the shuck. We've linked to the hand-drawn flyer advertising Jimmy Carter's visit in 1976, courtesy the University of North Texas. The video of the full speech Bill Clinton delivered in front of the Alamo Church, courtesy his presidential library, and the video of Laura Bush detailing her and President Bush's childhood connections to the Alamo. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast.